the United States said it doesn't need Canada and instantly lost control over its biggest energy supplier. That sentence aired on American radio this week. It came from the U.S. ambassador to Canada, a political appointee, Trump loyalist, former congressman, now the public voice of American diplomacy on the northern border. While he said those words, Canada's Prime Minister was stepping off a plane in Doha, the first sitting Canadian leader to ever visit Qatar. No press briefing, no leaks, no speculation. The visit happened. The deals followed. Same week, different signals. On Friday, Canada slashed tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles from 100% to just over 6%, up to 49,000 units per year. The same EVs targeted by American tariffs now have a new entry point through the northern border. On Sunday, Canada secured billions in infrastructure investment from one of the largest sovereign wealth funds in the world. Ports, rail, energy corridors, all moving forward without Washington. And on Monday morning, the ambassador said, "We don't need them." He was wrong. Here's what he forgot to mention. 60% of U.S. crude oil imports flow through Canadian pipelines. More than 80% of America's imported electricity comes from Canada. The U.S. nuclear grid runs on Canadian uranium. American farms run on Canadian fertilizer. And the Northeastern power grid, New York, Vermont, Maine, is physically dependent on hydroelectricity from Quebec. There is no backup. These aren't symbolic ties. These are structural links. The grid runs because Canada sends power. The refineries run because Canada sends oil. The shelves stay stocked because Canadian freight crosses south. And this week, Canada began testing how far it can shift. The message wasn't verbal. It wasn't confrontational. It was procedural, quiet, and immediate. A tariff reset. A diplomatic first. An energy corridor realignment. Washington didn't initiate this shift. Washington didn't authorize it. Washington didn't even notice it until it was over. This is the cost of underestimating quiet partners. This is what happens when confidence becomes assumption. And this is why that radio interview may become the most expensive sentence in America's energy history. The United States imports more energy from Canada than from any other country on Earth. That fact rarely makes headlines. It's not dramatic. It doesn't trend. But it defines the reality of the U.S. economy. Start with oil. In 2024, over 60% of America's crude oil imports came from one place: Canada, not Saudi Arabia, not Venezuela, not domestic fracking, Canada. That oil enters through a web of pipelines stretching from Alberta to Illinois, Minnesota, Texas. Every major refinery cluster in the American Midwest processes Canadian crude. That flow isn't optional. It's integrated. Now consider electricity. The United States imports more than 80% of its foreign electricity from Canada. That energy comes from hydroelectric dams in Quebec and Manitoba. It powers New York, Vermont, Maine, New Hampshire, not as a supplement, as a baseload. If the tap slows by even 10 to 15%, the Northeast grid can't compensate. There is no alternative line. No backup means no leverage. Move to gas. Natural gas from Canada flows south through decades-old infrastructure pipelines laid when bilateral trust was assumed. That gas heats homes, fuels power plants, and buffers price spikes when U.S. reserves tighten. And it flows under regulatory regimes Canada still honors for now. Then uranium. Nearly all the enriched uranium fueling U.S. nuclear reactors originates from Canada. The United States has processing capabilities. It does not have the same volume of raw material, and no substitute trade route has been finalized. The same applies to fertilizer. American farms rely on nitrogen and potash sourced from Canadian manufacturers. Without it, crop yields drop. prices spike, and global exports tighten. The ag supply chain is not diversified. It was never designed to be. It was designed under the assumption that Canada would always comply. That assumption no longer holds. Because while Washington repeats phrases like energy independence, the system still runs on Canadian flow. Energy security, food stability, and grid reliability are not isolated, they're layered. And Canada sits at the base of each. What makes this more fragile? Not one of these systems has a redundant path. There is no second Quebec. There is no spare oil pipeline from Alaska to the Midwest. There is no third-party uranium source that can scale in under a decade. This isn't hypothetical. In 2021, a single legal challenge against the Line 5 pipeline between Ontario and Michigan triggered diplomatic escalations, supply threats, and regional panic. The dispute wasn't resolved through force. It was paused through negotiation. The pipeline still runs. But the precedent is clear. Any disruption, legal or political, can rattle the entire system. And that system has now been publicly dismissed by the U.S. ambassador. That dismissal wasn't just careless. It was strategically reckless. Because it told Ottawa and every Canadian investor that Washington doesn't recognize the leverage it lives on. That the links built over 50 years can be ignored without consequence. That interdependence can be waved away on radio. And Canada heard it. Which is why this week matters. Not because Canada issued a response, but because it didn't. Instead, it moved power. It moved capital. It moved policy. Without warning. Without confrontation. Without permission. That is the signal Washington missed. Canada no longer needs to escalate to act. It just needs to reroute, and the infrastructure to do that is already under construction. Canada didn't argue. It moved. While headlines in Washington revolved around tariffs, speeches, and political signaling, Ottawa changed its position quietly, structurally, and irreversibly. Start with Friday. On January 19, Canada announced a tariff reduction on Chinese electric vehicles. The cut was dramatic. From 100% the same level the United States imposed down to just over 6%. The new ceiling allows for 49,000 Chinese EVs to enter the Canadian market annually. That number isn't theoretical. It's active policy. It resets the flow of trade. And more importantly, it creates a backdoor. Every EV model banned under US tariffs can now move through Canada. The Port of Vancouver, the auto terminals in Ontario, the cross-border logistics hubs in Michigan and New York, all now part of a new corridor. Not blocked. Rerouted. Washington framed its tariffs as protectionist. Ottawa reframed the supply chain. That wasn't a mistake. That was step one. Now shift to Sunday, January 21. Prime Minister Carney landed in Doha. No warning. No leaks. No build-up. A diplomatic first. No Canadian Prime Minister had ever set foot in Qatar while in office. That changed. Within 36 hours, Canada secured multi-billion-dollar investment commitments from Qatar's sovereign wealth fund. Not promises, not memos, commitments. Focused on energy corridors, port expansions, digital infrastructure, and logistics modernization, all on Canadian soil. What makes this moment significant isn't the money. It's the timing. The United States spent the last year attempting to pressure Canada into compliance. On EV standards. On LNG routes. On critical minerals. That pressure yielded no shift. But Canada didn't retaliate. It diversified. It didn't counter US tariffs. It removed its own. It didn't reject US investment. It secured alternative capital. And it didn't wait for approval. It scheduled flights. Now zoom out. Over the past 90 days, Canada has done the following. Signed a new hydrogen and LNG export agreement with Germany. Finalized infrastructure co-investments with Japan and the UAE. Reopened high-level trade dialogue with China after a 4-year freeze. expanded Pacific shipping capacity via Prince Rupert and Vancouver, launched feasibility studies on new transcontinental rail extensions connecting central Canada to the west coast bypassing U.S. customs and rail dependency. These aren't white papers, these are projects, and the centerpiece is already active. LNG Canada. Located in Kitimat, British Columbia, LNG Canada is the largest energy infrastructure project in Canadian history. Cost $40 billion. Backed by Shell, Petronas, PetroChina, Mitsubishi, and Korea Gas. First cargo shipped June 2025. Since then, more than 25 outbound shipments to Asia. This facility wasn't built to serve the United States. It was built to bypass it, to take Western Canadian gas, traditionally routed through U.S. pipelines, and send it directly across the Pacific. And it's not alone. Woodfibre LNG is under construction. So is Cedar LNG. Both scheduled for completion within 2 years. Both backed by Asian and Middle Eastern capital. Both permitted under Canadian regulatory pathways, with no U.S. oversight. These terminals change geography, because once natural gas starts flowing east, it doesn't flow south again. The infrastructure is path-dependent. The market adjusts around availability, and the price premium follows the ships. This is the shift Washington failed to see. The United States believed Canada wouldn't move. Too integrated. Too close. Too dependent. But Canada didn't need to leave. It only needed to unlock alternatives. And that's exactly what's happening, not in theory, but in ports, contracts, and ships already on the water. The most dangerous assumption in geopolitics is that friends don't walk away. Canada isn't threatening. It's not shouting. It's showing. And in global trade, what you show is what you shift. This didn't start with tariffs. It started with assumptions. Washington believed 3 things about Canada. All 3 were wrong. And now, the consequences are compounding not just in Ottawa, but globally. Start with the first assumption. Canada couldn't diversify. For decades, U.S. policymakers operated on the belief that Canada had nowhere else to go. The supply chains were too intertwined. The infrastructure, too U.S. dependent. The political class too aligned. No matter how tense the rhetoric, Canada would always return to the table because the table was American. That assumption collapsed in 90 days. In that window, Canada signed energy deals with Germany, reopened strategic talks with China, secured Gulf capital, and began rerouting LNG to Asia. These weren't speculative. They were executed. While Washington debated protectionist measures, Ottawa executed a pivot. And it worked because the world said yes, not because of Canada's size, but because of its credibility. The stability of its institutions. The predictability of its regulations. The scale of its resources. Investors didn't need a new supplier. They needed one they could trust. Canada fit the criteria. And the offers followed. Assumption 2. Pressure works faster than adaptation. This is the cornerstone of most U.S. trade strategy. Apply tariffs. Threaten supply lines. Leverage scale. Force recalibration. But Canada didn't recalibrate. It absorbed. The EV tariff cut wasn't a reaction. It was already in motion before the ambassador spoke. The Qatar visit wasn't spontaneous. It was scheduled months in advance. The LNG ships didn't launch because of rhetoric. They launched because the terminals were already built. By the time Washington noticed movement, it was watching lagging indicators, because adaptation doesn't happen on camera. It happens in permits, contracts, shipments, and investment flows. And those flows have already shifted. Which brings us to the final, most expensive assumption. Dismissive language signals strength. It doesn't. When the U.S. ambassador said, "We don't need Canada," he wasn't projecting dominance. He was revealing concern. Confidence doesn't speak that way. Confidence acts. When a country has leverage, it doesn't need to say so. When it doesn't, it tries to convince others. Or worse, itself. Investors hear those statements differently. They hear volatility, risk, noise, political instability, uncertain trade partners. And they reroute capital accordingly, because capital doesn't reward ego. It rewards predictability. And right now, Canada is delivering more of it than the United States, which is why the ripple effects don't stop at the 49th parallel. Other middle powers are watching closely. Mexico, Indonesia, Australia, the Nordics, Southeast Asian states. For years, they've accepted asymmetric trade terms with the US because the alternatives felt riskier. Canada just proved that's no longer true. That exit is possible. That decoupling isn't collapse, it's transition. This week wasn't just about two neighbors disagreeing. It was a stress test. And the message it sent to every capital watching was simple. If Canada can shift, so can we. That's the real damage. Not the oil. Not the EVs. Not the grid. The psychology. Because once the idea of diversification enters the room, it doesn't leave. It lingers. It spreads. It becomes a scenario. Every minister, every boardroom, every supply chain planner now has to consider the American bet for 70 years was simple. Allies don't leave. They negotiate. They complain. But they stay. This week, that bet broke. And once one partner leaves the table, the others don't sit still. The US said, "We don't need Canada." That same week, Canada proved it no longer needs permission. Chinese electric vehicles are now flowing through the northern border untaxed. Qatari billions are funding Canadian infrastructure unrestricted. A $40 billion LNG terminal is exporting gas across the Pacific uninterrupted. And Washington's response? A defensive interview. A sentence that revealed more than it concealed. Because here's what real power does: it doesn't broadcast, it builds. And by the time anyone notices, the ships are already sailing, the pipelines are already pressurized, and the trade routes are already drawn. That's where we are now. This isn't about diplomacy. It's not about alliances. It's about systems. And those systems are shifting. Canada didn't issue a threat. It didn't file a complaint. It just moved the supply chain. And once infrastructure shifts, it doesn't come back. Ports don't repivot. Energy contracts don't reverse. Rail doesn't get relayed because someone asked nicely. You don't get a second Canada. And every country watching knows it. The United States just lost its most reliable supplier, not because of conflict, but because of complacency. And now the question facing every global partner isn't, are we next? It's, what's our exit plan?